Warning. Without listening to reason, you can create an explosive situation. Wednesday, January 8, 1991, 12:04 p.m. The explosion, which occurred at 3D473 Pentalia Road on the date and time indicated, blew out all the windows on the front of the house and two side windows in the adjacent house. The safety glass stuck into the old oak tree, which was quietly shedding its last leaves in preparation for the rest of the winter. The driver's door had been thrown 100 feet onto the neighbor's lawn, and the passenger door was horribly warped and hanging on one burnt hinge. The heat generated by the explosion melted the asphalt driveway underneath the car. All property damage will eventually be repaired, leaving the remains of the vehicle in police custody until every square inch has been thoroughly inspected by various state, local, and federal authorities. What is left of Nick Welliton will be cremated and his ashes scattered to the wind. That night, on the local and national news, a grim, uniformed police captain announced that a member of the organized crime squad, namely Detective Nicholas Welliton, died when his stealthy police cruiser exploded as he was getting into his car to begin his 1:00 to 9:00 p.m. shift. The captain continued by saying that the preliminary investigation indicated that an explosive device was used, but since the investigation had just begun, they had no immediate suspects. He added the usual promises. Every effort will be made, no stone will be left unturned, all resources of the department, etc., etc. In the morning, the newspaper would profile a heroic, dedicated police officer who had worked for the Fullerton Police Department for 12 years, describing him as a devoted husband and father of 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 11. Along with repeating many of the things his commanding officer, Captain Nathan Hartwig, had said on the evening news, the reporter also mentioned that Detective Welliton was the nephew of the state's Lieutenant Governor, Wilford Breh. Wednesday, January 8, 1991, 5:45 p.m. My wife, Arlene, was usually home about 5 o'clock, but under the circumstances I wasn't surprised she was kept, so I started making dinner while our 2 sons, Kevin, 13, and Danny, 9, presumably did their homework, upstairs in their rooms. For the past 3 years, my wife Arlene has been a civilian member of the Fullerton Police Department assigned to the Organized Crime Unit. She was one of the unit's secretaries, a position she took over after Danny started preschool. My name is Mike Foley, and I am a Fullerton County Sheriff's deputy assigned to the Emergency Services Division. I just finished my 7:00 to 3:00 p.m. shift, and of course heard various reports of an explosion. So I was not surprised to see a very emotionally distressed wife who had just walked through the door. I had just finished checking the fried chicken when Arlene sat down heavily on the kitchen chair and said in a trembling voice, on the verge of tears, "I suppose you've already heard the news," she asked suspiciously. "Of course," I replied. "Such news travels quite quickly." "I feel sorry for his wife and children. It will be difficult for them, especially the children. The entire unit has been put on overtime, and some detectives from other units have been temporarily assigned to assist with the investigation," she said without looking at me. I poured her a Jack Daniels and Coke and said soothingly, "Drink this, it will help you calm down." She absent-mindedly took a sip, staring into space. Arlene and I were married for over 15 years. We met at a community college when I was in the GI program there. Bill after serving 2 tours in the Middle East with the U.S. Army. On a normal day, Arlene is a very attractive woman, an ordinary soccer mom. On special occasions when we go out in the evening, she attracts everyone's attention. At 5'8" with sandy hair streaked with blonde, she weighs 135, and although I never learned to judge bra size, she wore a dress size 10, and although she didn't have huge breasts, they were quite large to beautifully accentuate the clothes and show a little cleavage when she wanted it. She was only 5 pounds heavier than when I met her, and although she always looked back at her fat mirror, I thought it was perfect and often told her so. I'm 6'3", 245 pounds, average looking, I think. I have blue eyes, brown hair, and normal facial features, except for a souvenir I brought back from Iraq, a thin scar that runs from the middle of my left ear to my jawline. It looked pretty scary when I first got it, but has faded over time. Unfortunately, our department does not allow facial hair on uniformed personnel other than a mustache, so it is still visible. Arlene says it gives me a mystique and adds to my tough guy image. Fullerton is in many ways similar to Los Angeles, smaller, not in area, but in population. Just like in Los Angeles, where the LAPD patrols the city and the Sheriff's Department patrols much of the rest of Los Angeles County, Fullerton has a similar arrangement. Although each unit is autonomous, there is a symbiotic relationship between them. In fact, there is some duplication of effort in some areas, but I think it somehow serves political purposes. For several days after the explosion, Arlene seemed not distant but fragile. We've always had a pretty good sex life, a little slower over the years, but 3, sometimes 4 times a week, it was satisfactory. Those first few nights, I gave her some space, and although I didn't pursue sexual intimacy, she kept her arms around me as we slept, as if I were a lifeline on a stormy sea. After about a week of avoiding the topic, she seemed to be back to normal. So one evening after dinner, when the boys had gone to their rooms, I asked her if there had been any progress in the Welliton investigation. She shook her head and said, "No, at least as far as I know. I'm just a secretary, so they don't discuss it with me, but there were a lot of closed meetings with agents from other agencies. I know the state police and ATF are based in the building, but that's all I know." She seemed to become a little melancholy, and, sitting next to me, she put her arm around my neck and, pulling me towards her, kissed me softly. Then, laying her head on my chest, she whispered, "I love you, Mike." "I know," I answered. "I love you too, honey." July 4, 1990 afternoon. The Fullerton Police Department was hosting its annual picnic, and all employees were invited. I had only been able to attend one such event previously due to scheduling conflicts, and Arlene was thrilled when she found out that he could show me off to his colleagues, but this year the picnic fell on my day off. When I told her that I would be able to go with her, she didn't seem happy and even said, "Are you sure you want to go, honey? I remember how uncomfortable you were last time." "Absolutely," I answered with a conviction I didn't really feel. "Besides, what would I be doing here alone? The boys will spend the day at Seth's, playing in the Wang family pool." She gave me half-kind smiled and touched my hand as a sign of gratitude. As I said, there is a professional connection between the two departments, but also an unspoken rivalry. I only knew a few people in that department, and since Arlene would no doubt interact with the people she worked with, it would likely add to my sense of discomfort. As with most police departments or sheriff's offices, many detectives rose to their positions through political influence rather than merit. In my personal experience over 18 years of service, many of them were selfish incompetence. The police association provided food, hot dogs, burgers, salads, corn, and soft drinks, but if you wanted beer, wine, or something stronger, you had to bring your own. I took a few bottles of beer with me and a bottle of white wine for Arlene. For her part, she only took toilet paper since the county park where the picnic was being held was quite wild and was often known for running out of this essential item. When I parked and opened the trunk to get the cooler, Arlene said she would go ahead to get us a table. Luckily, the cooler had wheels, as the path through the forest leading to the picnic area and tables was quite long. When I came out of the woods, there were already about 100 people there, and since it was a family event, there were wives and children there, all sitting or walking around, chatting and keeping an eye on the younger children. The tables closest to the path were already occupied, and when I looked around for my wife, I saw her talking to a guy on the other side of the picnic area at a table occupied by other couples. Arlene was standing at an angle so that she was facing me, and when she saw me coming, she waved and smiled at me, and the guy she was talking to looked at me for a moment before walking away. Although he wasn't tall, maybe 5'8" or 9, I noticed he was a good-looking guy with wavy black hair. What I found strange was that everyone was wearing shorts or jeans and t-shirts or colorful shirts, but he was wearing a black silk shirt, white pants, and dressy shoes. He looked out of place, but I didn't think much of it at the time. As I placed the cooler next to the others, I greeted Arlene's co-worker Shelley and her husband John, and was introduced to Nancy, another secretary from a different department, and her boyfriend Hank. I had met Shelley and John several times and knew he was an electrician. During the conversation, I learned that Hank was a high school math teacher. Over the next hour or so, we made small talk, ate burgers and hot dogs that the volunteers cooked, and drank a few beers. John and I got along well as I worked in electronics in the Army, and he, as an electrician, was expanding his business to include installing home entertainment and security systems for residential and commercial properties. Although Hank seemed like a genuinely nice guy, as a teacher he had little to add to the conversation, but he listened carefully and contributed from time to time. Half an hour later, I needed to go to the toilet, and rather than having to walk across a field only to find that it was out of paper, I took a roll of toilet paper from Arlene's bag and went there as discreetly as possible. The men's room was empty when I walked in, so I had a choice of 3 booths and chose the one furthest from the door. I had just sat down when I heard 2 men come in, talking and heading towards the urinals. "Typical Nick," one of them said. "Yes, he comes to the picnic as if he were dressed for the yacht club," answered a deeper voice. "It's nice to have money. I saw his new red Jaguar in the parking lot." The first guy added in a slightly sarcastic tone. "Yes, and having a hook in the governor's office certainly didn't hurt him." "Have you ever worked with him?" "When we were in uniform," answered a deeper voice. "Nick the Jerk" was his nickname. He could persuade the nun to take off her cassock. I chased anyone in a skirt then. I heard the sound of water running into the sink, as the first guy said. "I don't think much has changed. I heard that he is sleeping with one of the secretaries, a married one at that." "Which one?" asked another. "I'm not sure, but there are only 4 girls in the building, all beautiful, and all but one are married. Someday he will be caught. Either his wife will catch him, or some husband will turn off his light." The voices faded as the door closed behind them, and my stomach began to churn with worry. It was obvious that the guy my wife was talking to was probably the same Nick the Jerk that those 2 cops were talking about in the restroom. When I returned to the table, only Nancy, Hank, and Arlene were sitting there, so I asked, "What happened to John and Shelley? Have they already left?" "No," Nancy answered with a sly smile. "They have been married for less than a year and recently found out factually pregnant. They just went for a romantic walk to the lake." "Well, let them enjoy it while they can," Hank said, laughing, "because when you have kids, there's no time left for romance." Nancy playfully threw a folded napkin at his head and whispered, "Ass." We all laughed, but my laughter was more forced, since the seed of suspicion had already been implanted in my mind. Arlene never gave me any reason to doubt her fidelity. It never even crossed my mind until today. The guy my wife was talking to was probably the same Nick the Jerk the 2 cops were talking about in the restroom. Knowing his type, there was a good chance that his boasting was just talk meant to improve his reputation as the local ladies' man. However, if this is true, then there were 2 undeniable things that I needed to consider. First of all, there were only 4 secretaries in the building, one of whom was single, and the other 3 were married, and one of them was my wife. As far as I could remember, our sex life had not worsened, but I noticed that Arlene had been acting differently lately, nervous, maybe distracted. Another fact to consider is that Arlene never worked overtime, never went shopping with her friends, went bowling, or participated in any activities outside the home unless it involved me or the children. There were 2 or 3 times a year when she attended retirement or promotion parties, but I couldn't even remember when the last time was. Of course, there were those moments every 2 weeks when I worked in the evenings, but with 2 children aged 13 and 9 at home, it wouldn't be long before any unusual delay became apparent. Therefore, the only time she would be involved in any lustful encounters would be during her lunch break. Not likely, I thought. After the picnic, we picked up the boys from Wang's house, but politely declined the burgers and beer as we were still full from the picnic. The boys went upstairs to change out of their swimsuits, and I finally settled for a bottle of beer, while Arlene and Laura Wang chatted in the kitchen over a glass of wine. Phil Wang was a veterinarian and a bit of a police fanatic, and he used to ask me about anything exciting that might have happened to me recently. He never talked about his profession. The rest of the weekend was spent as usual, with family activities. I was on shift from 3:00 p.m. to 11:00 p.m. on Monday, but as usual, I got up early, and while Arlene got ready for work, I got the boys up and put the coffee on. The boys had to be at school by 8:15, and I had already walked them to the bus stop when my wife came downstairs for a quick coffee and snack. The first thing I noticed was that while she usually wears slacks, a conservative blouse, and comfortable shoes, today she was wearing a black skirt, white silk blouse, and modest heels. Her outfit, of course, was not provocative, just unusual. She always wore a little makeup, so it didn't cause any alarm. What caught my attention was the faint scent of perfume as she walked past me to pour the coffee. I don't remember her ever wearing perfume unless we were going out in the evening, or she was in the mood to get a little naughty before bed. This was all probably due to my paranoia caused by those two cops in the toilet. However, I was determined to dispel these stupid suspicions once and for all. The problem was how. Police officers do not have access to the stealth that many other professions have. I wear a uniform, drive a patrol car, and have a GPS in my car that shows my exact location at any given time on a large monitor at headquarters. Also, considering that I have 2 children, a mortgage, and 2 car payments, I have absolutely no available funds to pay for a private investigator. But I had Joe Sheridan. Joe was a newly appointed Fullerton County Sheriff's deputy when he was assigned to me as a training officer after graduating from the academy. Like me, he was an Army veteran who served in Iraq. Joe also took advantage of the GI. Bill went to college to become a computer specialist. After receiving his degree, he tried unsuccessfully to lobby for the creation of a computer crimes unit in the sheriff's office, which was in the plans but was far from being realized. Once the county cut its submitted budget, several ambitious plans had to be shelved, and one of them was a computer crimes unit. The Fullerton Police Department had a computer crimes unit consisting of 3 civilian officers. The problem for them was that they needed a sworn officer to run the operation, and none of their officers were qualified. As soon as Joe learned of the vacancy, he applied, and since he was already a sworn officer on the staff, the Fullerton Police Department waived all normal recruiting requirements and hired him to run the department. Joe was a little younger than me, but because of our shared combat experience, we became immediate friends. Ultimately, when he and his wife Rosalie were looking for a house, he thought he would stay with the sheriff's office, so they bought a house in a community near mine, and since it was convenient for commuting into the city, they decided to stay there. We crossed paths from time to time, and he and his wife visited our house several times, and we visited theirs. I had to ask him to quietly investigate another officer, which was undoubtedly against department policy, and I had to explain to him why. I reached him on his office phone, and after a few pleasantries asked him to call me back on his cell phone. Joe was a smart guy and immediately realized that I wanted to discuss something outside of official business, so he agreed without hesitation. 15 minutes later, he called back, and, not wanting to offend him, I told him my concerns directly and asked if he could do some digging for me. Without hesitation, he replied, "I can get some personal file data straight from my desktop, and I have a few guys in the field who owe me a favor so that I can contact them discreetly. I hope you're wrong, Mike, but I understand why you need to know, and your name will never be mentioned." 5 days later, I received a call from Joe on my cell phone, and he asked without preamble, "Do you have a few minutes? You can speak?" When I answered yes to both questions, he began. "First, what I have learned cannot definitively satisfy your request, but let me say that some of the information is from confidential personnel files that I have accessed without the risk of detection. Other information has been obtained from reliable sources with little or no risk of repercussions. Nick Willayton, or Nick the Jerk, as he is known in some circles, is the nephew of the lieutenant governor. A jealous husband filed a complaint against him when he caught Nick and his wife dancing close together in a club frequented by cheaters. The IAB investigated but found no concrete evidence, so Nick got away with a slight scare from his boss. 6 months later, he was caught having sex in a car in his sector at night. He was a training officer for a young recruit in the car, and in her application to terminate her contract, she claimed that she only did it because he threatened her with a bad evaluation if she did not cooperate. Since she was still on probation, she was fired, and thanks to the intervention of his uncle, he only received a week's leave. He was promoted to detective almost 3 years ago and assigned to the general service of the 2nd Precinct. He was not liked by his teammates or the detective lieutenant who was his superior. It was alleged that he had a brief affair with a married secretary of the station, but since this was not proven, he was not officially punished, but the secretary was transferred, and when the rumor reached her husband, they divorced. He essentially became persona non grata on the team and was ignored. His uncle intervened again and arranged for him to be transferred to the Organized Crime Division, much to the displeasure of the current boss, Captain Hartwig. He managed to keep his pants buttoned for a while, but then rumors started that he was sleeping with one of the secretaries there, a woman named Shelley Longmire. She was engaged then, and now her name is Shelley Price, and she's pregnant. There's a secret bet among the guys there whether the baby will have blonde hair, like her and her husband, or black hair, like Willatona. Another source told me that Welliton's wife, Marilyn, either suspected or found out about his affairs, but since they have 3 children, she decided to turn a blind eye to it, at least for a while. She's a nurse at the county hospital, and it seems like she's tired of playing a supporting role because there are rumors that she's secretly dating one of the doctors. That last bit of information is unpleasant and cannot be mitigated in any way, but let me emphasize that it is speculative. Arlene was apparently seen going to lunch with him several times. What made my source suspicious was that since he cannot use his company car to transport civilians and his car has a GPS tracker, he drove his car to the non-employee side of the parking lot, which showed that the car was there, and a few minutes later my source saw your wife leaving for lunch and picking him up in her car. The person I was talking about is not a fan Willatona, and when he accidentally noticed this maneuver the first time, he became wary and noticed the same thing 2 more times. He often works in the fields, so that's all he could say for sure. Oh yes, Joe added casually, besides the fact that he considers himself God's gift to women, he has a lot of money. It's probably family money left to him since he has a big house in a posh area, a new Jaguar, a 26-foot cabin cruiser, all these toys. Why he wants to be a policeman, no one knows. I did not interrupt my friend throughout his story, although my blood pressure must have risen considerably. The information left no doubt that this guy was a scoundrel who preyed on married women, and if he didn't have a hook in the governor's office, he would have been fired a long time ago. Interrupting my thoughts, Joe said, "That's all I have, Mike. Just remember that there is no direct evidence. People love to gossip and rumors grow exponentially." I answered sincerely. "I really appreciate your help, Joe. I hope you haven't put yourself in a position where you could get into trouble with the department." He grinned and replied, "No way, buddy. I'm just a computer nerd, but I'm the best they have, and I don't leave a trace." For personal inquiries, the questions were asked in a way that would never arouse suspicion, and it would be easy to get dirty details about someone who was so unpopular. I thanked him again, and we hung up. He was right about the direct evidence, but I also knew that where there is smoke, there is fire. My goal now was to either prove it or forget it, for my own peace of mind and for the sake of our marriage. Either way, I knew I'd have a conversation with Nick the Jerk. A week had passed since my conversation with Joe, and everything at home was as usual. Arlene showed no change in behavior, was as loving as ever, and we had sex several times during the week. My wife loved sex and was not inhibited, often initiating it as often as I did. I began to question my paranoia, but I still couldn't shake the thoughts about those secret dinners. A few days later, on my day off, I felt anxious again. I had sent the boys off to school, put on the coffee, and was making soft eggs for Arlene when I heard her come into the kitchen from behind. Of course, I became acutely aware of any changes in her manners and clothing. So when she reappeared in a skirt, low-cut blouse, and heels, I was stunned. Her hair was down and her makeup was a little more dramatic. I complimented her appearance and asked what the occasion was. Fast ran through guilt on her face. She probably knew I would notice and prepared an explanation. "Oh, that," she said, looking down at herself, making a hand gesture. "I just wanted to look beautiful. The pants and shirts I usually wear are almost like a uniform, and I want to feel attractive sometimes. Besides, the girls and I are going to have lunch together today." With a smile that I didn't feel, I said, "Well, considering that you work mostly with men, I'm not sure I'm glad you look so attractive." She laughed and, swallowing a piece of toast with an egg, said, "Don't worry, honey, they're all either married or busy. Besides, I'm just an old lady compared to most of them. I just want to feel feminine sometimes." "Well, just remember that you are my old lady," I said with a slight note in my voice. With a smile that seemed a little tense, she walked up to me, leaned over and kissed me on the lips, then looked at her watch and said, "Oh, I have to go. I'm a little late." She looked a little nervous as she left and avoided eye contact as she said, "Love you," at the door. Looking at the kitchen clock, I realized that she was not late, but on the contrary, she still had 10 minutes. Also, knowing it was my day off, she didn't ask about my plans for the day, which was unusual. Was it paranoia after Joe planted more seeds of doubt in my head? Perhaps, but I wasn't going to sit back and hope for the best. A plan was forming in my head, and after a short time I decided to bring it to life. Like I said, I couldn't afford a private investigator, but I could afford to rent a car, so I called and reserved a car with Rent-A-Wreck. My pickup wouldn't be suitable for discreet surveillance, but the inconspicuous Chevy Vega I picked up an hour later was quite suitable. At 11:15, I took a spot in the visitor's parking lot where I could observe Arlene's car and the entrance to her building. Without a doubt, this idiot was in his unmarked car, and although I didn't know which one it was, I probably remembered his face from the picnic. I didn't know if I would need them, but I took small binoculars and a camera with me. My rental car was partially hidden from the building, so my occasional use of binoculars should not have been easily visible from the building's windows, or so I hoped. Getting caught spying on the organized crime department would definitely raise questions and put me in an awkward position. At 11:45 a.m., several people began leaving the building for lunch, and at 12:05 p.m., I saw Walayton walked out the front door and got into the red Cadillac. As far as I knew, he didn't have a Cadillac. He had a Jaguar and his wife had a Lexus SUV, so I figured it might be a vehicle the department had seized under RICO laws. He pulled into the visitor's parking lot and parked about 150 feet away from me as I slid into my seat. His car was parked with his back to the exit, and I saw him periodically checking his mirrors, waiting for someone or something. I prayed it wasn't Arlene who he was waiting for. Unfortunately, a few minutes later, it was she who appeared. He quickly got out of the Cadillac and got into the passenger seat of Arlene's car. At least there weren't any displays of affection like kissing or hugging. Arlene was focused on getting out of the parking lot as quickly as possible, so as soon as the door closed, she began to move. She pulled out of the parking lot and headed south on Pinecrest, a 4-lane highway lined with commercial buildings and fast food restaurants on either side. Since the idiot had no rear view and Arlene would never have thought she was being followed, I maintained a comfortable distance behind them. They drove about 2 miles and finally turned into a Taco Bell. With no choice, I continued forward a few hundred feet, turned left into the parking lot, and was able to get back into the northbound lane and park in the lot across from the restaurant. At this time of day, the Taco Bell parking lot was full, and my position did not allow me to see the side of the lot with the drive-through window, so I didn't know if they were in line or parked out of my line of sight. In any case, I had no choice but to continue observing. 10 minutes later, I had my answer when they came out carrying a white paper bag and a cardboard drink holder. Back in the car, they turned right onto Pinecrest, continuing south, and I received several signals as I crossed the northbound lane in pursuit. I was now about 8 cars behind, aggressively inching closer, when less than a mile later I saw my wife's turn signal light up as she turned into the very county park where the picnic was being held. Luckily, I was still 5 cars and a few moments behind as I slowly pulled into the park. I saw them park at the very end of the lot, and I parked my rental car about 200 feet diagonally from them. There were several other cars in the parking lot, most of which were closer to the play area. Apart from an elderly man walking his dog, all the other people were young mothers pushing their children on swings or hunting them at the foot of the hill. I watched as they ate their fast food and chatted animatedly while sitting in their seats in the front seat. When they finished, the bastard came out and threw the trash in a trash can near the van. He took a quick look around before returning and then went inside again. I knew the chatting was over because he immediately moved closer to Arlene and hugged her. Within a few moments, they started kissing. I felt a tightness in my chest and difficulty breathing, which made me feel dizzy. I had to turn away and take a few deep breaths to compose myself. At this point, I didn't care who saw me, so I stood up from my semi-sitting position and grabbed the camera, taking a few pictures through the zoom lens. After taking a few candid shots, I picked up the binoculars again, which allowed me to see better inside the van. I was tempted to just drive up to them, drag him out of the car and beat him up, but I was in such a state of rage that I was afraid I might kill him. I had already killed an enemy, and although it did not bring me joy, killing this bastard would not deprive me of a moment of sleep. I also wanted to just move away and end my misery, but something, perhaps morbid curiosity or masochism, kept me there, forcing me to watch my marriage crumble. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when I pulled my pickup up to the house. The boys were due back in an hour, so I opened a beer, sat in my chair, and tried to process what I saw. However, her insistent pushback could be due to the fact that their relationship had not reached that level of intimacy, or that she was offended by his attempt to achieve quick sex in a car in a parking lot. I was hoping and leaning towards the first option. It may have been my desire, but I wasn't ready to end our marriage, at least not yet. Apparently, this bastard was a known predator and would continue to stalk her until he reached his goal. There was one more thing that I couldn't forget. I had to have a serious conversation with Nick the Jerk. The next day, when I had another day off, I was back in the visitors' parking lot at 11:15 and both cars, his Cadillac and Arlene's van, were there. I was hoping there would be no more lunch meetings, and at 12:10 p.m. Wellington left the building, got into his car and drove away. My heart was racing as I continued to watch Arlene's car, but she never left the building, and at 1:30 Wellington returned and went inside. I left the rental car and was prepared to wait up to 5 hours to follow Wellington home. I knew his address, but I wanted to observe the route in order to prepare for our conversation. I was glad when he left at 3:45 and hoped he was heading straight home. On the way to his house, I noted several sparsely populated places where I could waylay him. The next day was Friday, the start of my shift from 3:00 to 11:00 p.m., and as an emergency responder, I did not have a regular patrol station and was often on scene for short periods. Unfortunately, my vehicle, a highly mobile van, was more visible than the patrol car. The vehicle was equipped to deal with a variety of unusual situations, such as a mine-clearing robot, sniper rifles, body armor, tear gas, flash-bang grenades, night vision goggles, and even a small remote device that could peer around corners and transmit a color image in real time to an 8-inch screen. It was fortunate that my target lived outside the city and within my jurisdiction, and although I was not expected to constantly move, it was a rule that I had to move around the area, creating the illusion of police omnipresence, so it was possible that the chief monitoring the map, the GPS, would have noticed any long stops or my being on a sparsely populated street and could have asked questions about my reasons. Mindful of this idiot's habit of leaving early, I arrived at the chosen location on a rural street that intersected his route at 4:30 and was pleased when his Cadillac passed me at 5:05. I immediately drove out and, having caught up with his car, turned on the overhead beacon. I didn't use the siren, hoping not to attract any further attention, even though the street consisted mostly of large houses set back from the road. At this stage, he probably didn't know who I was, but I followed standard stopping procedure and stood directly behind the driver's window, forcing him to turn his head at an unusual angle to see me. However, instead of asking for his license and registration, I said through the open window, "Get out of the car, idiot, and keep your hands visible." I saw that he was already holding his ID and badge in his hand, but he had to turn slightly in his seat to see me, and he hissed angrily, "What did you just tell me?" "Sorry," I said sincerely. "Get out of the car, Mr. Idiot." His door swung open as he quickly stood up, ready for a confrontation. Before he continued, I said in a subdued voice, "I know who you are, Welliton, and you can call anyone, including your uncle in the governor's office, but first you and I will have a little chat." I walked closer and emphasized the word, "Let's talk," by poking him in the chest with my finger so hard that he took a step back. Before he could object, I continued, "I not only know who you are, I know what kind of person you are. You're a scoundrel who likes to sleep with married women. If you haven't figured it out yet, detective, I'm a husband, Arlene Foley, and I know you're trying to get her into bed. So here's what's going to happen, asshole. From now on, you stop trying to get another married woman to bed, at least mine. If you don't stop, the consequences will be serious. As for complaining to your uncle, think twice. Your boss will be happy to get you back into shape, and the police chief will be happy to add your head to his trophy collection. Plus, the governor and your uncle are so far behind in the polls that it will take a miracle to get re-elected in November." "You're crazy," he spat. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're crazy. I do not make unwanted advances towards women, married or unmarried." He chuckled, emphasizing the word undesirable, and continued sarcastically, "So if your wife gets pleasure on the side, it's none of my business. Maybe you should look in the mirror and see what she's missing at home." I wanted more than anything to tear his head off, but I knew that he was provoking me to do this, so I just growled, "You've been warned, bastard, and if I were you, I'd take it seriously." I worked the evening shift on the weekend, but at home it was business as usual. Saturday night when I got home, Arlene was awake and our sex was fantastic. Several weeks had passed since my confrontation with Welliton, and, as I expected, I had heard nothing from management regarding the complaint. During this time, I checked several times to see if there were any lunch meetings, and there were none. Of course, I couldn't be there every day, but I figured he either got the warning or was laying low. I suspected the latter, but hoped for the former. Scum like him won't sit still after such personal humiliation. Unfortunately, after a few weeks, I became even more careless, and when Arlene announced that the girls were throwing Shelley a surprise baby shower after work on Friday, I didn't think much of it. However, I remembered the comments in the bathroom at the picnic and wondered what color the baby's hair would be. On Thursday night, after dinner, Arlene wrapped the party favor in blue and pink paper and ribbon to take with her in the morning. I was working the day shift on Friday, so I left home before she went to work. On Friday afternoon, I returned home around 4 o'clock and dismissed the nanny. The boys and I played basketball in the driveway for about an hour, and then I started cooking dinner. Arlene said the party would be from 6 to 10 p.m. at the American Legion Hall, which was about 20 minutes from us. At 10:30, I began to worry, but not suspect that she was late. At 10:45, my paranoia began to set in, and I paged her. A few minutes later, she called back and said that she would be home in 15 minutes and that everyone was staying for coffee. When she got home, she looked fine, except her eyes were a little glassy, which I attributed to the wine, cocktail, or drink she was drinking. I asked how the party went, and she answered briefly, "Fine. Everyone had a good time and Shelley was delighted." Arlene usually got quite playful when she drank, so I thought we were in for an evening. But when we got into bed and I walked over to her, she made an excuse, saying that she had a headache from the wine and gave me a delay for the next night. After we got into bed, she kissed me goodnight, told me she loved me, and turned on her side to turn off the light. Usually she would cuddle up to me, but that night she just stayed on her side and seemed to fall asleep immediately. I didn't care, so I quickly fell asleep too. I usually sleep soundly, but at some point I woke up. It was one of those moments when you wake up unexpectedly and don't know what woke you up. I lay quietly, listening for anything that might wake me, but the house was quiet. After a few moments, as my drowsiness gradually dissipated, I realized that it was not the noise that had woken me, but the movement, and although we were not touching, I felt her body shaking slightly. There was just enough light in the room for me to see, and as I slowly turned my head, I saw Arlene clutching her pillow and sobbing quietly. I didn't show that I woke up. I just lay there with a heavy feeling in my soul. She eventually fell asleep, but I lay awake most of the night, thinking. At 5:30, I quietly got out of bed and went to the bathroom, quietly closing the door behind me. Between the bathroom and the bedroom, there were two small dressing rooms, one on each side, men's and women's. We each had our own laundry basket, and I opened Arlene's closet and turned on the light. At this point, my heart was pounding, and I was praying that I wouldn't find what I was looking for. Unfortunately, about halfway through the laundry basket, I found evidence of her infidelity. My heart sank and my legs gave way so that I had to lean on the wall to keep from falling. I stood there, looking at the proof for what seemed like an eternity, but it was probably only 5 minutes. I put everything back in place and went back to bed, not knowing how to deal with it. Feeling my movement in bed, Arlene, although she was sleeping, instinctively pressed herself against me, putting her arm around my shoulder. I didn't remove her hand, but I didn't return her hug either. I just lay there with thoughts of her betrayal running through my head. I had a choice, and I needed to make a decision soon. I could show her the evidence and file for divorce. He could demand a confession and put her on a short leash if she showed sincere repentance. From her quiet sobs last night, I was pretty sure she was already regretting her misdeed. Confronting her and trying to gain some mental satisfaction would have thwarted the plan of revenge that had begun to take shape in my head. She didn't hear me the next morning when I stood in the kitchen doorway. She stood leaning on the tabletop, with her head bowed, shaking it slightly, as if in denial. When the boys arrived for breakfast, she was especially affectionate, hugging and kissing them tightly. I tried to remain as calm as possible, avoiding any intimacy. Given our usual tactile intimacy, I think she was starting to feel a little paranoid about whether I was suspicious of something on her part after last night. When I left for work without kissing her and just saying goodbye, I saw in her eyes that she was beginning to struggle with her inner demons, and as cruel as it was, I felt some satisfaction from that. I had my own demons to deal with, and one of them was Nick the Jerkwalaton. Over the next few days, Arlene was very affectionate towards me, but I remained somewhat distant, finding reasons not to have sex when we went to bed at night. Every day she became more and more nervous and restless. I realized that I was delaying the inevitable and that a collision was inevitable. On the fourth night, after the boys had gone to their rooms and Arlene was clearing the table, I walked up behind her and put my hand on her shoulder. She literally jumped, screamed, and dropped the glass into the sink, where it shattered on the porcelain. Turning around, with her hand on her chest, she exclaimed, "Oh God, Mike, you scared the living daylights out of me." She began to remove the fragments, but I firmly said, "Leave it. Come on, we need to talk." The look on her face could only be described as pure panic, but she obediently followed me into the living room. I sat down in a chair, and she sat on the edge of the sofa opposite me. This was the most difficult conversation of my life, and without preparing a speech, I immediately got down to business. "Arlene, I know you had an affair, and I know with whom." To her credit, she didn't start shouting out the usual excuses that spouses caught cheating on repeat. She just sank down on the sofa and, covering her face with her hands, began to sob quietly. I tried to maintain the appearance of justice, but inside my heart was pounding wildly and my stomach was churning. But I continued. "You not only broke your vows, but more importantly, you broke my heart. But before I continue, I have one question, the answer to which may obviate the need for further discussion. Have you stopped loving me?" "Oh God, Mike, no please, Mike no, under no circumstances think that way, please." She jumped up from the sofa and hurried towards me, but I raised both hands and said insistently, "Sit back down, Arlene." She stopped halfway between us, a look of despair on her face, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Please sit down," I said more gently. "We have a lot to discuss, and what you say now could determine the future of our marriage. No matter how hard it will be for you and for me, I need the truth." I was pretty sure, or at least hoped, that I knew the answers to the questions I was about to ask, but they needed to be asked to get any closure. First of all, how long has this been going on? How many times have you had sex with him? Anguish was written all over her face, and then she began to hiccup, which was typical of my wife when she became depressed. I slowly stood up and said, "I need to go to the toilet. I'll get you some water. When I return, I will expect you to tell me everything. Just remember that I know more than you think," I lied. I barely made it to the toilet before my bowels were empty, and as I sat there, I felt nauseous at the prospect of going back and hearing the sordid details of my wife's betrayal. When I finally returned to the living room with a glass of water and a box of tissues, Arlene's hiccups had passed, but she drank the water greedily. There was an expression on her face that I could only describe as pained determination. She looked at me with swollen red eyes and began hesitantly. "I know it sounds corny now, but I never stopped loving you, not for a moment, not for a second. I can't tell you how ashamed I am, not because I got caught, but because I gave in to temptation. I wanted to confess, but I was afraid of losing you, losing our family. I knew something was wrong the morning after the party when you didn't kiss me goodbye or tell me you loved me. The last 3 days have been hell for me, and now I know they have been hell for you too, knowing that your wife betrayed you in the worst possible way. I don't know what came over me." She winced for a moment at her choice of words, but quickly recovered. "I don't know what I was thinking. I probably didn't think so." She no longer looked at me, but rather through me, continuing. "Nick is a master of seduction, and although I knew he was having a brief affair with another girl in the office, I allowed it to continue. I was flattered that this young, handsome guy could be interested in an older married woman, and he gradually complimented me. He always said nice things about my hair, clothes, perfume, and ultimately how sexy I was and what a great figure I had. When he finally invited me to dinner, I convinced myself that there was nothing wrong with it. I found excuses for not telling you about it. This should have been my first sign, but I chose to ignore it and enjoy his flattery, so I secretly went out to lunch with him several times. I convinced myself that this was normal, since there was no intimacy other than his hands on my waist when he walked me through the door, or his hands on mine in a cafe to emphasize a certain moment, and one day in the car I kissed him. However, the conversations became more personal, not in a sexual way, but in a personal way. He confided in me that he is in a loveless marriage and believes his wife is cheating on him with a doctor she works with, but they are staying together for the sake of the children. I told him what a wonderful marriage we have and how proud I am of you and our boys. He was supportive and said how great it was to have such a sexy, vivacious wife to share your life with. Although he was attractive and attentive, I never thought of him as anything other than a friend. I was delusional in telling myself that the only reason I didn't tell you about our dinners was so that you might get jealous for no reason, but looking back, I should have realized that I had fallen into his trap. Arlene stopped talking for a moment and, looking at me briefly with a pleading expression on her face, looked away again and continued in a trembling voice. "Oh God, Mike, it's so hard to admit, so hard to say, but you asked me how many times." After a short pause and a deep breath, she forced herself to continue. "It really only happened once after a shower. He convinced me that he only needed to be with me once. He said he knew we could never be lovers and that I loved my husband, but if he could one day experience my full essence, he would be satisfied." She started shaking her head as if trying to push away the memories and grabbed some tissues as the tears started flowing again. Looking down at her feet and sobbing, she said, "I can't say I wasn't a little intrigued by the prospect. You're the only man I've ever been with, and the novelty and mischief got the better of me. The night after my shower, I made up an excuse to leave early and met him at the motel. Something she said lingered in my head, and I interrupted her with a question. You said it was really only one time. That's a clarifying statement, Arlene. What did you mean by really? I think you're missing something. Please, Mike, don't make me say more. I'm already ashamed. You can't imagine how difficult this is for me. Damn it, Arlene, I screamed. You think this is hard for you, but how do you think I feel right now? My wife lied to me many times and topped off the lies by sleeping with a serial womanizer in a motel. You either tell me what really means or this conversation is over. She was crying so hard that I realized that there would be no answer until she pulled herself together. My previous calm was quickly disappearing, and to avoid saying something I would regret, I said angrily, I need something to drink. My intention when I walked into the kitchen was to grab some water and calm down, but I decided that for whatever might happen next, duct tape would be more appropriate. I lingered in the kitchen for a few minutes, sipping my drink and giving Arlene time to collect herself. When I returned with another glass of scotch, my wife's sobs had subsided a little. I sat down and waited. Finally, she found the courage to continue. I told you about the farewell dinner we had for SGT Mosgrove 2 weeks ago. The captain gave us all an extra hour and answered the calls himself while we were away. We all went to Mulligan's Irish pub nearby, and most of us drank beer or other drinks. He, Nick, persuaded me to take Cosmopolitan instead of white wine. You know I rarely drink strong drinks, and by the end of the party I had 3. Arlene, get to the point, I growled. She was stalling for time. I knew it, and she knew it, so I was afraid of what would happen next. Okay, she said weakly. It's just, well, I can't. I drank too much. Arlene. Good. We had just returned to the office when the captain asked me to go up to the archives to get the files he needed. Nick must have overheard because I had only been there a minute or two when someone came in. I got scared, and when I turned around, I saw him, and that's where it happened. She wanted to say something else, but I shouted, Damn, Arlen, how can this just happen? I know that I look like some kind of woman of easy virtue, and believe me, that's how I felt. All I can say in my defense is that I love you with all my heart and stupidly fell into a trap, for which I will be ashamed all my life. After a pause, she added, There's something else I need to tell you. Damn it, what else could it be, I thought. I was afraid to ask, so I just sat there, stunned, and looked at her. Even before we walked into the room that night, I knew it would never happen again. I was so nervous that I felt sick. I kept asking myself, why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything I love for a stupid experience? When we were in the room, he sensed my lack of enthusiasm and began to behave aggressively. He simply took me by force. He tried to justify his behavior by saying that he had waited so long that he could not control himself and simply lost his head. Tears were flowing from my eyes, and when I told him that there would be no next time, not today, not ever, he stood up and took something from the dresser that looked like a camera and said, Don't worry, sweetheart. There will be a next time, and once you overcome your inhibitions, you'll be begging for more, especially if you don't want your husband to see this video. I was terrified and furious, and if I had a knife, I would have stabbed him. I couldn't believe how stupid I was to let such a devious bastard deceive me so easily. I didn't even clean up. I just put on some clothes and demanded that he take me back to the car. He tried to calm me down with his compliments on the way back, but I just looked out the side window and tried not to burst into tears. I was shaking so much and crying so hard that I just sat in the car for half an hour before I could even try to drive. It took all my courage to walk into that house and know that I would meet the man I love, the man I betrayed. She was silent for a long time, and I was lost in my thoughts. I was still angry at her, but not so much out of jealousy. However, the thought that she deliberately allowed this flirtation to develop hurt me. But the rage and contempt for this scoundrel, a policeman, was beyond measurement. Finally, she, having no more tears, looked at me with a pleading voice and said, Mike, I know I don't deserve this, but I pray that you forgive me. I hope I didn't destroy all your love for me. I stood up, walked over to the sofa, and extended my hand to her. Arlene took it hesitantly, and I led her upstairs. Tonight was not a night for reproach or self-pity. I learned a lot in the army, and one of the important things was not to take revenge without a plan, and tonight was the night for planning. My wife and I had a lot of conversations over the next week, and although we didn't have a sexual relationship, it was mostly due to her inability to forgive herself. I heard so many apologies and requests not to leave her that I was ready to strangle her. I asked her if he'd approached her since then, and she said he hadn't said anything directly, but sometimes when he was in the office, he'd open a desk drawer and put the camera on the desk, and then turn around and either grin or winked. She has. Based on her account of that night, I highly doubt he had some kind of video and was using it as a ruse to intimidate his victims into submission. One evening, we were sitting on the sofa, and suddenly she began to cry and pour out reproachful words, but I was tired of it. We still didn't make love, and most nights I woke up to her soft sobs into my pillow. I was disappointed and probably said it more harshly than I intended. Enough, Arlene. Okay, you screwed up. We are human, and we make mistakes, but you have to forgive yourself so we can get our lives back. Of course, it still hurts, but the pain will not go away unless you stop this self-flagellation. You walk on eggshells, and it affects not only me but also the boys. I want my life and my wife back, so no more apologies, okay? I told her what I know about Bellatone, but not how I knew it, and I never told her about that day in the park when I followed her. I was puzzled that she didn't see his superficial attempt at cheap sexual gratification as a warning sign, but I didn't dwell on it. Without going into detail, I told her about the marriages and careers he had destroyed and emphasized that he was a predator and would not stop until someone stopped him. Judging by her look, I think she understood my hint, but did not ask any questions. We made love that night, and I thought we had turned a page in our lives. It was the first night in weeks that we slept peacefully, and in the morning I saw that my old Arlene had begun to return. My problem was that Nick Welliton was still at large, and although I knew my wife was safe from his predispositions, he would continue to make her life miserable before moving on to the next victim. But that didn't last long. More than 2 months have passed since this bastard was burned in his yard, and I learned from careful inquiries that the investigation into his death has reached a dead end. Despite the best efforts of city, county, and federal investigators, no connection has been found to any of the cases in which he was or was involved. So I wasn't too surprised when I received a 1020 call from the dispatcher during the day shift. Code 1020 means report to command. In the case of patrol officers, this could mean district control, but in my case, it meant headquarters, where all the special services had their offices. When I entered the building, Deputy Doug Monahan was on duty at the counter, overseeing the inner sanctum. Mike was always on duty, and there wasn't a single person in the department who didn't enjoy his sunny disposition or occasional Irish jokes. He could have retired 10 years ago, but having been widowed at an early age and with 2 grown children, work gave him a reason to get up every morning. "Good morning, Doug," I said, approaching his dais through the empty lobby. He tilted his head and raised his gray eyebrow, leaned forward and whispered, "Aren't you in trouble, Mikey kid?" "Why would I be in trouble?" I asked nonchalantly. "I don't know, but I was told to send you to the deputy chief's office when you arrive, and he's not alone. There are some people in suits that I haven't seen before, but they smell like feds." We exchanged a few joking words, and Doug let me through the turnstile, and I headed up to the second floor. When I walked into my boss's office, his secretary looked at my badge and said nervously, "Oh, Deputy Foley, yes, they are waiting for you in the conference room at the end of the hallway." When I entered the spacious room, 6 men were sitting around a table, and the fact that no one was talking and all eyes were on me when I opened the door suggested that the secretary had warned them of my arrival. I recognized 2 of them. One was our chief deputy, Thomas Pendergrast, and the other was a Fullerton police captain who was on camera the night of the death Welliton. According to protocol, I gave a casual salute to my boss. He simply nodded and asked me to sit down. Tom was a lieutenant and my superior when I first joined the department 18 years ago. He was a distinguished man, now in his 50s, with graying hair and an imposing presence. We got along well, and he was one of the people who facilitated my appointment to the Emergency Services Division. He was popular with staff and county commissioners and will likely take over as sheriff when he retires next year. He introduced me to the men seated around the table, starting from his left. He named Captain Hartwig of the City Police, Detective Sergeant Piccolo, also from the city, Agents Mason and Holmes of the ATF, and Special Agent Lupo of the FBI. Without further ado, the boss began his prepared speech. With a slight gesture of his hand towards the others, he said, "These people are part of the investigation into the death of Detective Nicholas Layton, and I have agreed to allow them to speak to you in the spirit of interagency cooperation. However, as you probably know, since this is an informal meeting, you are not under oath and have the right to refuse to answer questions or have a union lawyer present. In light of what I just explained, would you like to take advantage of one of these opportunities?" "No, sir, I don't want to yet. If there is anything I can do to help with the investigation, I am willing to do so." "Captain Hartwig, do you have any questions for the deputy?" Captain Hartwig was a large black man with drooping eyelids and a face that seemed constantly amused. In a deep baritone, he replied, "Not yet, Chief. I was Welleton's commander, but I was not an integral part of the investigation." Agent Mason, a short man with a prominent nose and narrow eyes, intervened and said in a nasal tone, "If you don't mind, Chief, I'd like to ask Deputy Foley a few questions." Before he could continue, Chief Pendergrast said in a condescending tone, "Agent Mason, we are all sworn law enforcement officers here, and for the purposes of this informal interview, I would ask that we all use the titles assigned to us. So if you have questions for Deputy Foley, please contact him accordingly." Mason's face turned red with reproach, but he quickly recovered and asked, "Deputy Foley, did you know or have you ever met Detective Zellaton?" "I don't remember," I answered sincerely. "In fact, I don't recall any interaction with Fullerton City Police detectives." "What about off-duty? Didn't you attend the City Police picnic last July?" "Yes, I accompanied my wife, who is a civilian employee of the department, but I was not introduced to any of the detectives from the organized crime unit. I spent time with two of my wife's colleagues and their common-law husbands." "Is there a purpose here, Agent Mason?" I asked innocently. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that the FBI agent looked amused at Mason's growing frustration. As an FBI agent, he was probably a lawyer and knew not to ask questions you didn't know the answers to. Despite the fact that this was an informal interview, Mason, not being an experienced investigator, established that I was an interested person within the first 3 minutes of the meeting. He leafed through some papers in the folder in front of him and, looking at me with an accusing gaze, asked, "Your records indicate that you are an Army veteran and served an 18-month tour in Iraq as an ammunition technician. Could you explain, Deputy, what the responsibilities of an ammunition technician were?" "Well," I replied with a hint of sarcasm, "ammunition includes everything from bullets to bombs, but my specialized training was in destroying or dismantling WIDE's improvised explosive devices." "Specifically, how did you complete these tasks?" "Well, it depends. If it was an wide that did not pose a threat to people or structures, I simply blew it up with a rifle shot. If it was in a building or a market, we would use a robot to make sure it wasn't a trap, and then I would go in and determine if it could be deactivated. It wasn't an exact science, and some of my fellow soldiers came home in body bags." Mason seemed unimpressed and continued, "So if you know how to take a bomb apart, you must know how to put one back together, right?" I grinned and replied, "Yes, almost anyone can. You don't think these Taliban have engineering degrees from MIT, right? All you need is explosives, a detonator, a 12-volt battery, and a container. Listen, Mason. Excuse me, Agent Mason, what are you hinting at? Because I and hundreds of other soldiers knew how to assemble an explosive device that I decided to indifferently kill a policeman. You can go online now and find out how to make bombs that are much more complex than the ones I've had to deal with." Mason grinned and said sarcastically, "I didn't say indifferent, Deputy. Are you aware, Foley, that there is a rumor that your wife was having an affair with Detective Welliton?" I jumped up and ran towards the table to get to the little bastard, but the FBI agent and the city detective grabbed me before I could hit him. Mason pushed his chair back against the wall and looked like he had wet himself. When I had calmed down, the FBI agent walked up to Mason, leaned a few inches from his face, and hissed, "Get out, asshole. Wait outside. In fact, don't wait outside. Just go back to your office, and I'll deal with you later." Mason muttered something in response, but eventually left the office. Apparently, Special Agent Lupo was going to be a good cop, because he immediately apologized for Mason and asked me in a conciliatory tone, "Do you mind, Deputy, if we continue in a less hostile manner?" I hesitated, but finally nodded and sat down, but just as he was about to continue, Captain Hartwig interrupted in his deep voice. "I don't think I'm taking any chances because Detective Welliton's personnel file can be obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. However, at the moment, no news agency is reporting it requested, and we have decided not to make it public to protect his family." At this point, I noticed Agent Lupo shift in his chair, apparently uncomfortable with this disclosure so early in the investigation. Nicholas Welliton has been accused several times of having sex with married women. Thanks to the intervention of his uncle, who was the lieutenant governor, only one charge resulted in disciplinary action. But no matter how disgusting his moral character was, we are not here to judge him, but to find who was responsible for his murder. As a police officer, you know that many cases are solved based on rumors. I'll be honest, if we interviewed every husband or boyfriend associated with Mr. Kenner Welliton, we would have to double our investigative team. The detective sergeant sitting to Hartwig's left turned his head and coughed to hide his chuckle. I also noticed that Hartwig moved from Detective Welliton to Nicholas Welliton to Mr. Welliton when talking about the victim. Police departments are quasi-military organizations, and like combat troops, police officers depend on their colleagues when situations escalate. This need for unconditional support gives rise to certain unspoken rules of behavior. One of the rules is that, whether you are married or not, you do not sleep with your colleague's wife or girlfriend, even if she is the initiator. As with any organization, not everyone follows these rules, but most do. I got the impression from Captain Hartwig's words and behavior that his department was taking a back seat in this investigation, allowing the feds to handle the case. Almost confirming my suspicion, Agent Lupo continued. As the captain said, a rumor is just a rumor. The rumor that Agent Mason so inappropriately referred to could have been caused by nothing more than a smile, his leaning on her desk, or laughing at a joke. Honestly, such a vague rumor would not have received so much attention if it weren't for your military experience and knowledge of explosives. My job, however, is to find out how stable your relationship with your wife is. Have there been any recent difficulties that might suggest that your wife and Detective Welliton may have had a relationship? I should have laughed at his clumsy attempt to avoid the word romance, but after a pause I replied, "You mean friends with benefits, right?" Before he could answer, I continued, "I find this question quite intrusive, but to close this question, I will answer. I hate to sound sappy, but Arlene and I have the best marriage of any couple I know. I love her unconditionally, just as she loves me, and we never miss an opportunity to express that love. To answer another question that may be on your mind, my wife doesn't go to bachelorette parties or be on teams or organizations that require her to leave the house. We do almost everything together, and when I work nights, she takes care of our 2 young sons. Oh, and we make love 3 to 4 times a week," I added sarcastically. The boss chuckled, and I noticed a fleeting smile on Hartwig's lips. Agent Lupo did not react. In fact, he didn't miss a beat when he continued to say, "There is another possibility, Deputy, and I mention this only as a possibility, not an accusation. Your wife and the late detective worked together, and as an investigator, he was not always in the office. Was an opportunity for them to meet during her lunch break. I didn't expect this and didn't react. I was at a critical stage. My buddy Joe may have already been interviewed and admitted to seeing Arlene and Welleton leaving the building in her car. He may have already admitted to being Joe's contact, and it would be easy to trace our personal connection. However, either Lupo was the best poker player in the world, or he was simply embracing all the relationship possibilities. I had no choice but to trust my instincts and let events take their course. So, after a few thoughtful expressions and a slight nod of my head, I replied, "First of all, Agent, your original question was about the stability of my marriage, and I think I've covered that. Is there a chance that my wife, or any wife could have a quick sexual encounter while they are going to the market, picking up the kids from soccer, or getting their hair done? Certainly. But if I remember my college psychology courses correctly, most women start an affair emotionally before they start sexually. A guy, or should I say a certain type of guy, often has the goal of conquest or quick sexual gratification. Remembering the information from Joe, and knowing that these people were aware of why Welleton was finally punished by blackmailing the rookie, I decided to take a chance. This type of guy can do it behind a bush, in an alley, in the back seat of a car. We all know of men in power who have used their positions to either openly or psychologically blackmail subordinates for sex. Hell, we even know presidents who. Okay, Foley, Agent Lupo said irritably, we get your point, but... I leaned forward and, looking into his eyes, said, "No, you don't understand, Lupo. This should have been an interview, and you turned it into a witch hunt." In a more subdued voice, I continued, "If you were sitting in this chair and I was making derogatory remarks about your wife, I don't think you would put up with it as long as I did. I'm here because you have a dead, slutty cop who works in the same building, and whose husband served his country in a role that may or may not include the death of the victim. Do your job, Lupo, and stop trying to find a convenient solution to your case at the expense of me and my wife." With these words, I stood up and, looking at my boss, asked, "If I'm done here, Chief, I'd like to get back to work." Pendergrast nodded at me and said, "You can go, Deputy, and thank you for coming." As I walked out of the building, I felt pretty good about my show of outrage, but I knew the FBI wasn't going to just give up and go back to Washington. March 19, 1991. It was the day after the so-called interview and my usual day off. We usually get up at 6:30, shower, then make breakfast for the boys and get them ready for the school bus, which arrives at 7:45. However, on my days off, I usually put off showering until everyone is out of the house to reduce the fuss. Arlene was still in the shower at 6:45 when I heard the doorbell ring, repeated several times, followed by knocking on the door. I put on my terry robe and, reaching into the nightstand, pocketed my Ruger 380 and headed downstairs. I had my hand in my pocket with a gun as I opened the door to the length of the security chain. I looked outside and saw Agent Lupo in his blue FBI jacket. "What do you need?" I said irritably. "And why did you come to my house at such a time?" He said in a soft voice, "Mike, I have a search warrant for your home and car." He briefly held up a piece of paper, and I could make out the words, "search warrant." "My wife is in the shower, and the kids are getting ready for school. Couldn't you wait for a better time?" I growled. "Listen, Deputy," he said more forcefully, "I don't like being here, but if you cooperate, we can do this less painfully and discreetly. Please open the door so we can discuss this quietly inside." I took off the chain, and as I stood back, a female sheriff's deputy, whom I vaguely recognized, came in behind him. He introduced her as Deputy Gonzalez and asked us to sit down. I pointed him towards the sofa, and they both sat down, and I sat in the wing chair next to him. Before he could speak, I said, "Let me ask you something, Agent Lupo. This was on my mind yesterday before our interview ended abruptly. This is a murder investigation, so why is the FBI involved?" It won't be 20 questions. I have a job to do, and I intend to do it with or without your cooperation. It will be done. However, I will tell you this. Detective Welleton was partially involved with our joint organized crime task force, and while we have not found a connection that even remotely amounts to the level of retaliation, it is not something we have completely ruled out. Now let's get down to the protocol. As a professional courtesy, I have scheduled our arrival at a time when most of your neighbors are still sleeping or busy getting ready for work. There are other cars on the street and other employees who will be participating. I kept the numbers to a minimum and all the cars were unmarked. I know your department often uses your unit to assist detectives in executing warrants, so this is nothing new for you. The warrant has limited parameters. You know we are not looking for weapons, illegal substances, or gambling receipts. You also know that we must follow procedural guidelines in such matters. One of these guidelines is that the occupants of the home should have limited access during the search. Deputy Gonzalez is here to ensure that your wife has limited, if any, access to the areas of the home that will be searched. As I said, we will do this in the least intrusive manner possible, so if your wife wants to go to work, which I suggest, Deputy Gonzalez will accompany you upstairs while you explain to her what is going on. If she decides to stay, the deputy will be with her while the search continues. There are 2 ATF agents on the street who will be the main investigators, and before you ask, Mason is not one of them. One was a detective in the NYPD, and the other was a munitions technician in the U.S. Navy. I know you have a mistrust of our federal agencies, but if you think these guys are going to sprinkle fairy dust in the right places to set you up, you're wrong. This is what will happen. The house search will not begin until your sons leave for school. However, Deputy Gonzalez will have to watch your wife while she feeds them and gets them ready for school. She works for the sheriff's department, so it would be easy for her to explain the deputy's presence. We will soon begin searching the vehicles which, since we are using a dog, can be done while the vehicles remain in the garage. Once the search of the vehicles is completed, they will be moved to the driveway to complete the search of the garage. Then the shed in the yard will be inspected, and by then the boys, and perhaps Mrs. Foley, will be gone.